All right, let's jump right into today's deep dive. We're taking a close look at a pretty interesting document, Chap04, Department of Defense, From Mandate for Leadership, The Conservative Promise.
Yeah.
It's essentially a blueprint of sorts, laying out a conservative vision for the U.S. military in 2025.
Hmm.
So whether you follow military strategy closely or you're just curious about the future of American power, I think we've got some really fascinating stuff to unpack today.
I think you're right, and what jumps out immediately is just how much this document fixates on China.
Oh, yeah.
It's pretty blunt. It portrays China as the biggest threat to U.S. interests globally, no question.
It definitely sets a strong tone. I mean, beyond just saying China is a threat, though, what specifically are they pointing to? What about China is raising such big red flags for them?
The document focuses on three main things: China's rapidly growing military, their expanding economic clout, and their ambitions to become a dominant force.
Okay, so they're hitting on those kind of classic power dynamics: military might, economic influence, and, of course, ambition on the world stage.
Exactly, and they're arguing that all of that together requires a pretty significant shift in U.S. strategy.
Okay, so then how do they propose the U.S. should respond to all of this? I mean, is it just about military muscle, or are there other ideas at play?
Well, the document advocates for what they call a denial defense strategy.
Denial defense.
Oh.
Okay, break that down for me.
It might sound a little complicated at first, but the core idea is to make any aggressive move by China against Taiwan or U.S. allies so costly, so painful, that they're essentially deterred from even trying.
So basically making the potential consequences so high that aggression is off the table from the start.
Exactly. It's about deterring China through strength. And to do that, they suggest things like increasing defense spending, bolstering the U.S. military presence in the region, and forging even stronger alliances with countries in the Pacific.
It's about sending a very clear signal. Messing with us or our allies is not going to end well for you.
You got it. It's more than just reacting to China's moves. It's about establishing a posture that discourages those moves in the first place.
Okay, so a strong, proactive stance. But it's not just about focusing outward on China, right? This document also takes a pretty critical look inward at the current state of the U.S. military.
That's right. It's not exactly a flattering assessment.
Now, the criticisms are pretty sharp. They argue that the U.S. military has been weakened. They point to things like wasteful spending, what they see as a misplaced focus on social agendas rather than combat readiness.
They also talk about an overall decline in both effectiveness and morale.
It's a pretty bold statement.
There's a clear perception being laid out here. The current administration hasn't just made policy choices they disagree with, but that those choices have really fundamentally undermined the military's core capabilities and values.
Okay, so then can you give us a few concrete examples of these criticisms? And just as importantly, what do they propose as solutions? What specific areas do they want to see course corrected?
One major thing they call for is to bring back what they call a strong culture of command accountability.
Okay.
They argue that what they perceive as the politicization of the military needs to end. It's about going back to a military where, according to them, the chain of command is respected and effectiveness in combat is the top priority.
It sounds like they're advocating for a pretty traditional hierarchical model of military leadership.
Yeah, and they're also concerned about recruitment. They
Yeah.
want to see a lot of changes there.
Like what are some of their specific recommendations on that front?
Increased access for military recruiters to high schoolers, for one. Also, they're calling to make the ASV, that's the military entrance exam, mandatory for all high schoolers getting federal funding.
Wow. Okay.
And they even go so far as to suggest requiring members of Congress to give time to military recruiters at town halls.
Interesting. So it's about really upping the visibility of the military, making it more present in the lives of potential recruits.
Absolutely. It's about trying to boost both the quantity and the quality of new recruits coming in.
But are there other areas beyond just recruitment where they suggest changes to achieve this return to core values they talk about?
Oh, absolutely. They recommend expanding JROTC programs in schools, for instance.
Okay.
And they also call for reversing policies regarding transgender service members and even auditing military academies to remove what they call Marxist indoctrination.
Wow. Okay, these are some pretty strong statements.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't stop there, do they? I mean, they even address things like social media and the military's suicide rates.
You're right. They propose restricting social media use by service members to recruiting purposes only. And on the issue of suicide, Their argument is that there needs to be a shift in focus toward what they see as the actual underlying causal issues.
So according to them, it's about tackling those root causes head on rather than what they perceive as superficial or politically driven solutions.
That's the gist of it.
It sounds like this document paints a picture of a military that has, in their view, strayed from its core mission and values.
Yeah.
And they're offering a pretty, strong prescription for how to get it back on track. But it's not all doom and gloom, right? I mean, it's not just about pointing out problems. They also lay out a vision for modernizing the U.S. military, bringing it into the future.
You're right. It's not just looking back. It's about looking forward, too.
Yeah.
And a huge theme throughout the document is this need for technological advancement, innovation, staying ahead of the curve.
Because we're not the only ones advancing, right? I mean, you've got China, Russia, they're all making big leaps in military technology.
Absolutely.
So this document is arguing that the U.S. can't afford to fall behind.
Exactly. And that sense of urgency comes through pretty clearly.
But what does that modernization actually look like? I mean, what concrete steps are they proposing?
One of their key recommendations is to totally overhaul the DoD acquisition process.
Which, remind me, that's how the military buys new weapons and technology.
Right, and they argue that the current process is just way too slow, way too bureaucratic.
It's that classic government red tape.
Exactly. And it's making it really difficult to keep pace with how fast technology is changing these days.
So they want to streamline things, cut through the red tape, and make sure that the military can actually get the equipment it needs in a timely way.
Yeah, that's the goal. But it's not just about buying new gadgets. They also talk a lot about strengthening the whole U.S. defense industrial base.
So it's about more than just having the latest and greatest technology. It's about being able to produce it domestically, not having to rely on, who knows, maybe unreliable foreign suppliers.
Exactly. And they're arguing that a strong domestic defense industry is really key for national security.
It's about ensuring that the U.S. can maintain its military strength, even in times of global instability or conflict.
Exactly. And they make some specific recommendations about how to strengthen that defense industrial base.
Like what?
Well, they really like the idea of Buy American provisions, which basically means prioritizing U.S. companies when it comes to buying equipment and supplies.
Okay, so making sure that those contracts and dollars are staying within the U.S.
Right. They also want to see more support for small businesses that are in the defense sector.
Interesting. Why is that?
Well, they argue that smaller businesses are often a lot more innovative, a lot more agile than the big established defense contractors.
So it's about fostering this healthy, competitive defense industry here in the U.S.?
Exactly.
Making sure that the military has a reliable source for the latest and greatest, all homegrown.
You got it. And it gets even more interesting when you look at their recommendations for each individual branch of the military.
Okay, let's do it. What kind of vision are they laying out?
Well, with the Army, for example, they prioritize 6 key modernization programs.
Okay.
It's all about preparing the Army for a potential conflict against a major adversary.
So thinking about large-scale combat operations.
Right, and in a complex and contested environment.
Makes sense. So how about the Navy? What's their vision there?
They really push for a major expansion of the Navy's fleet.
How big are we talking?
They're aiming for 355 ships or more.
Whoa. That's a significant increase from what we have now.
Yeah, it's a pretty ambitious goal.
So what's the thinking there? Why such a big push for more ships?
They're focused on 2 main things: unmanned systems, things like drones and autonomous vehicles, and weapon systems that have a longer range and are more lethal.
So it's about projecting power further and being able to hit harder?
Exactly.
Makes sense. And the Air Force? Are they being left behind in this modernization push?
Not at all. They get a lot of attention in the document, too.
What are they recommending?
First of all, big budget increases.
Okay.
And then they want to see faster acquisition of new aircraft, particularly the F-35 and the B-21 bomber.
Those are some pretty high-tech, high-profile pieces of equipment.
And of course, they stress the importance of constantly developing even newer, more advanced weapons and capabilities.
So it's all about ensuring that the U.S. stays ahead of the game when it comes to air power.
Absolutely. It's about maintaining air superiority in a world where other countries are catching up fast.
Okay, so they've got big plans for the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. We've definitely got a lot more to talk about when it comes to the specifics of each branch.
Yeah, we haven't even touched on the Marine Corps or the Space Force yet.
It sounds like we've barely scratched the surface in this deep dive.
Get started.
All right, well, listeners, buckle up. We've got a lot more ground to cover.
Yeah, we're just getting warmed up. Let's dive into how this document envisions the future of the Marine Corps.
Okay, so Force Design 2030 is a big part of their vision.
Yeah, huge.
But for those of us who aren't, military strategists, what exactly does that mean? How are they thinking about reshaping the Marine Corps?
Well, imagine the Marines not so much storing beaches, but operating as this agile force, spread out, striking from all angles across vast distances.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
That's Force Design 2030 in a nutshell. Shifting away from those large-scale amphibious landings and toward a more distributed force, really agile, operating in those tough maritime environments.
So it's about being more nimble, more unpredictable.
Exactly. Think island hopping, sea denial, long-range strikes, that kind of thing.
So less about brute force and more about strategy and precision.
You got it. And to make this vision a reality, they're calling for some pretty big changes in terms of the equipment the Marines use, the whole structure of the force.
Like what? Give me some specifics.
One big one is divesting legacy systems, things they see as less relevant to this new vision.
Like what kinds of things?
Tanks, heavy artillery, those kinds of assets, they argue, are better suited for the Army in land warfare.
Makes sense. It's about making the Marine Corps more specialized for those unique maritime operations.
Right. So instead of tanks, they want to see more things like rocket artillery batteries.
Which are?
Systems like HIMARS, highly mobile, can strike from a distance. And they also want more upgraded light armored vehicles, those are LAVs, for reconnaissance and fire support.
Okay, so more flexible, mobile units. Yeah. And, of course, we have to talk about drones. They're everywhere these days.
Oh, absolutely. Unmanned aerial systems, UAS as they call them, those are a huge part of this vision.
And defending against them, too, I'd imagine.
For sure. They want the Marine Corps to be able to dominate the airspace no matter what.
It's not just about being mobile and spread out. It's about having the firepower and the air superiority to actually take on the enemy effectively.
You got it. And that means developing things like long-range strike missiles and anti-ship missiles, too.
So they can hit targets way out there.
Exactly. It's about precision, speed, and technological advantage.
It sounds like a pretty radical shift for the Marine Corps.
It is. It really is. But they also highlight something else that needs to change.
What's that?
The personnel paradigm.
Okay, now I'm really curious. What does that mean?
Well, they argue that the current rank structure, which puts a lot of responsibility on junior non-commissioned officers, needs to be adjusted.
Because?
They think modern warfare, with all the technology and the need for quick decision-making, requires more experience in those key leadership roles.
So more senior Marines leading squads and platoons.
Right. It's about recognizing that the demands on those junior NCOs are just huge.
And they're often the ones right there in the thick of it.
Exactly. And they also want to keep those experienced NCOs in the force longer.
Because losing them means losing valuable experience and expertise.
Exactly. So they recommend better incentives, more time between deployments.
So giving those Marines time to recover, reconnect with their families, and ultimately stay in the fight.
Right, because at the end of the day, it's the people who make up the force.
Taking care of them is just as important as any piece of equipment.
100%. And one last thing on the Marine Corps. This document stresses how important it is that the Navy's shipbuilding plans line up with this Force Design 2030 vision.
What does that mean? What kind of ships are they looking for to support this new way of doing things?
They call for light amphibious warships.
Light amphibious warships, so like smaller, more agile ships.
Exactly. Perfect for operating in, say, the Pacific.
So instead of a few big ships, which are, let's be honest, potentially vulnerable targets, you have this more distributed force that can operate more effectively in those contested waters.
You're getting it. And they also want a bigger fleet of the traditional amphibious warships just to make sure the Marines can project power globally.
Okay, so that's the Marine Corps. Now, what about the Space Force? They're still pretty new, still figuring things out. What does this document see for them?
It envisions a much more assertive Space Force.
Okay, what does that look like?
Well, it's about moving from primarily defense to offense.
Interesting.
The argument is that the current administration has been way too focused on defending our stuff in space, which leaves us vulnerable.
So instead of just protecting satellites, they're talking about being able to take out enemy satellites.
Exactly. They say this shift is key for deterring aggression in space.
It's basically saying, don't even think about messing with us in space, because we can hit back.
And they also want more investment in space control capabilities, extending our reach further out, even around the moon.
Sounds like they're preparing for a whole new kind of space race.
There's definitely that sense of urgency that we need to stay ahead of the game, particularly when it comes to China.
And they actually suggest something pretty surprising to achieve that,
What's that?
reducing secrecy.
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive, right?
Big time.
But their argument is that less secrecy means better collaboration with private companies, which are becoming, major players in space.
So recognizing that the government can't do it alone anymore.
Exactly. They also want to see some changes within the Space Force itself.
What kind of changes?
They want to move away from the current structure, this unity of effort thing, and go towards unity of command.
Okay, break that down for me.
Basically, it's about giving the Space Force more independence, more control.
So it can operate more effectively,
Right.
more decisively.
Exactly. And they even go so far as to suggest creating a Space Force Academy.
Whoa, like a West Point for space.
Exactly. It would be a huge statement about how seriously the U.S. is taking space as a military domain.
It would really signal that we're in it to win it.
Totally. This whole section really highlights just how important space is becoming in modern warfare and the challenges the U.S. faces in staying ahead of the curve.
It's amazing to think about space as this new battleground for national security.
It really is. And speaking of new battlegrounds, let's move on to Cyber Command. They have some pretty interesting ideas there, too.
Okay, I'm ready. What's their take on Cyber Command?
Well, right now, the head of Cyber Command also leads the NSA. It's a dual hat situation.
Right, I remember hearing about that.
This document wants to change that.
They want to separate Cyber Command from the NSA. Why is that? What's the thinking there?
They argue that having one person in charge of both creates conflicts of interest, and it limits Cyber Command's ability to act independently.
So Cyber Command needs more freedom, more flexibility to conduct those cyber operations.
Exactly, without being tied to the NSA's intelligence gathering mission.
Okay, I'm following you. So this is about giving Cyber Command more autonomy, more power to act on its own.
Absolutely. And they're pretty clear that they want to see Cyber Command take a much more aggressive approach.
Oh, yeah. So not just defending U.S. systems, but actually striking back against adversaries in cyberspace.
Exactly. It's not just about playing defense. It's about having the ability to go on offense when necessary.
To deter attacks, but also to respond forcefully if needed.
Right. But there's one area where they actually recommend less Cyber Command involvement.
What's that?
Election security.
Okay, I was going to say, that seems like a pretty crucial mission these days.
It is, but their argument is that having Cyber Command involved creates this perception of the military meddling in politics.
Okay, so it's about optics, maintaining that image of the military as nonpartisan.
Exactly. But even though they want to pull back from election security, they do have a whole bunch of recommendations for how to make Cyber Command more effective in other areas.
Like what? What are some of their ideas?
One big one is integrating cyber and electronic warfare capabilities.
Okay, so thinking about those two domains as really intertwined.
Yeah, like two sides of the same coin.
Mm-hmm.
And they want to push decision-making down to lower levels, giving commanders in the field more authority to conduct cyber operations.
So it's about speed, flexibility, being able to respond to threats in real time.
Exactly. And it's not all about offense either.
Okay, so what about defense? What do they say about that?
They talk a lot about cyber resilience, especially for critical infrastructure.
Things like the power grid, financial systems, those kinds of things.
Right. And the nuclear command, control, and communications network, that's a big one.
Because if those systems go down, it's game over.
Exactly. And finally, they stress the importance of working with allies on cyber operations.
It makes sense. I mean, cyber threats, they don't respect borders.
Exactly. Cyber warfare is a global challenge that requires global solutions.
It's really fascinating how they're tying all of this back to those traditional military concepts.
Like what?
Well, combined arms, joint operations.
Yeah.
It shows how cyber is becoming an essential part of modern warfare, not just this separate thing happening off on the side.
You're absolutely right. Cyber is woven into just about every aspect of military operations these days.
It really makes you think about how much warfare has changed, even just in the last few decades.
It's mind-boggling when you think about it. We've gone from traditional battlefields to these whole new domains of conflict, like cyberspace and outer space.
And speaking of which, we haven't talked about Special Operations Forces yet.
SOF, they have a really interesting role to play in all of this.
Okay, lay it on me. What does this document say about the future of Special Ops?
The document makes a pretty compelling argument for expanding the role of Special Operations Forces, SOF.
Okay, in what way? What are they suggesting?
They want SOF to be more involved in countering state actors like China and Russia.
So not just focused on non-state actors like terrorist groups.
Right. It's about shifting gears to focus more on great power competition.
So using SOF to counter those more traditional nation-state threats.
Exactly. They argue that SOF has this unique set of capabilities, unconventional warfare, intelligence gathering, working with partner forces all over the world. That makes them perfect for this kind of expanded role.
I can see how those skills would be variable in that kind of context, but I'm having trouble picturing how this would actually play out. Can you give me some concrete examples of how they see SOF being used in this way?
Sure, they specifically mention countering China's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI.
Ah, that massive global infrastructure project.
Exactly. The document sees it as a way for China to expand its influence around the world, and they suggest that SOF could be used to, disrupt those efforts, maybe even undermine them in strategically important regions.
So preventing China from gaining a foothold in those key areas,
Right, it's a very subtle, complex kind of competition.
like a global chess match.
Exactly. They also talk about using SOF to counter Russian disinformation campaigns, things like that, that fall under the umbrella of hybrid warfare.
It's almost like they're suggesting fighting fire with fire, using those same unconventional tactics to counter those unconventional threats.
You could put it that way. They see SOF as really critical in the gray zone. That space between war and peace where the lines are blurry and traditional military approaches don't really work.
So instead of just being this scalpel for precise strikes against terrorists, SOF could be a more flexible tool, something that can be used against a whole range of threats from major adversaries.
That's the idea. And they don't just talk about changing SOF's mission, they also recommend some pretty significant reforms to support this shift.
What kind of reforms? What needs to change within SOF to make all of this possible?
Well, one big one is making irregular warfare a cornerstone of U.S. security strategy.
So taking those unconventional warfare capabilities,
Yeah.
really making them central to how the U.S. military operates?
Right, not just a niche capability for special circumstances.
Okay, and how do they propose actually making that happen?
They suggest setting up an irregular warfare center of excellence, to train and equip SOF for this expanded role.
So really investing in those capabilities.
And they also emphasize the need to use all elements of national power, not just the military, but economic and diplomatic tools, too.
To counter those threats that are operating in that gray zone, those adversaries who aren't playing by the traditional rules.
Exactly. It's a lot to think about, but I think we're starting to get a sense of how this document sees the U.S. military evolving in a world where those lines between war and peace are getting blurrier and blurrier.
It's definitely a different kind of battlefield than what we were used to.
You're right. Traditional military power is still important, but it's not enough anymore. You need to be able to operate across the whole spectrum of conflict, from those high-intensity combat scenarios to that subtle maneuvering in the gray zone and everything in between.
And speaking of traditional military power, we haven't even talked about nuclear weapons yet.
Oh, yeah, the big one.
This document has a lot to say about nuclear deterrence and the challenges the U.S. faces in maintaining it in this new era of, competition with other major powers.
It really does. And it's definitely a more challenging landscape than it used to be.
What are some of the key challenges they point to? What makes nuclear deterrence so much harder today than it was, say, during the Cold War?
Well, back then it was pretty straightforward. You had the US and the Soviet Union, two main players. It was, a nuclear standoff, but it was a relatively stable one.
Right, a balance of terror kind of thing.
Exactly.
Right.
But now you've got multiple players, all with their own agendas and their own nuclear capabilities. It's a much more complex equation.
It's not just a two-player game anymore. It's like trying to juggle a bunch of chainsaws at the same time.
It's a good analogy. You're constantly trying to assess the intentions of multiple actors, figure out what their red lines are, and make sure that your own deterrent remains credible in their eyes.
And it's not just about who has the most nukes, right? It's about how those weapons are perceived, how they're integrated into a country's overall military strategy, and ultimately whether those countries are willing to actually use them.
That's exactly right. And the document points to Russia's increasingly aggressive posture as a real cause for concern.
Okay, so it's not just about the size of their nuclear arsenal, it's about their perceived willingness to use it.
Right, or at least to threaten to use it, which can be just as destabilizing.
It's like having a neighbor who keeps waving a loaded gun around. Even if they never actually fire it, it's still pretty unnerving.
And then you've got North Korea and Iran both continuing to develop their nuclear and missile capabilities.
It's a lot to keep track of. And I'm getting the sense that they're not just worried about what other countries are doing, they're also concerned about the state of America's own nuclear forces.
Yeah, that comes through pretty strongly. They argue that the U.S. nuclear triad is aging, needs modernization.
The triad being.
The land-based ICBMs, the submarine-launched missiles, and the strategic bombers. Those are the three legs of the U.S. nuclear deterrent.
And they're saying that those systems are becoming outdated, less reliable, and potentially vulnerable to new threats.
They argue that without significant investment, the U.S. risks losing its edge in the nuclear realm.
It's a sobering thought. So what do they propose doing about it?
They call for modernizing all three legs of the triad.
Okay, so what does that look like specifically?
They want to see faster development and deployment of new systems, things like the Sentinel ICBM, that's the replacement for the Minuteman III, the Columbia-class submarines to replace the Ohio-class.
Okay, so basically upgrading the delivery systems.
Right. And they also talk about new weapons like the long-range standoff weapon, that's LRSO for short, which is a nuclear-capable cruise missile that would be launched from bombers.
So not just the platforms themselves, but also the weapons they carry.
Exactly. And they're pushing for an upgrade of the B-21 bomber, the stealth bomber that's supposed to eventually replace the B-2.
They even mentioned the F-35, which can also carry nuclear weapons.
It's a multi-pronged approach to making sure the U.S. nuclear deterrent stays credible in the face of these evolving threats.
But it sounds like they're not content with just modernizing existing systems.
You're right. They go a step further and suggest potentially increasing warhead production.
Whoa, that's a big deal, especially considering all the efforts over the years to reduce the global nuclear stockpile.
They argue that to effectively deter both Russia and China, the U.S. might need a larger arsenal.
It's a bold statement.
Yeah.
It reflects a real shift in thinking about the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. strategy.
And it's not just about the warheads themselves. They also call for restoring the U.S. nuclear infrastructure. You know, the facilities where they produce plutonium pits and stuff.
So it's a really comprehensive approach to rebuilding America's nuclear capabilities.
From the ground up, they want to see a revitalized nuclear enterprise, one that can support a strong deterrent for decades to come.
Okay, so that's the nuclear side of things. But they also have a lot to say about missile defense. Right. How does that fit into their overall vision?
Missile defense is a huge priority for them.
They see it as a vital part of national security.
Exactly. They argue that missile defense can deter attacks, by making potential adversaries think twice about whether they could actually get their missiles through.
So it's about creating doubt, raising the stakes.
And if deterrence fails, missile defense can actually shoot down those incoming missiles, providing a layer of protection.
But missile defense is a really controversial issue. There are a lot of people who argue that it's a waste of money, that it doesn't really work, and that it could even make things more dangerous by provoking adversaries.
They address those concerns head-on. They argue that those fears about destabilizing things are overblown.
So they're pretty confident that missile defense is a net positive for U.S. security.
Exactly. They want to see a much more robust missile defense system, both for protecting the U.S. homeland and for defending U.S. interests around the world.
Okay, so give me some specifics. What kind of systems are they talking about?
Well, for homeland defense, they want to strengthen the existing ground-based mid-course defense system, GMD.
Which is currently focused on, what, North Korea?
Right. But they argue that the U.S. needs to be prepared for potential attacks from other countries, too, particularly Russia and China, as their missile capabilities continue to grow.
So a more comprehensive homeland defense system, one that can handle multiple threats simultaneously.
Exactly. And then for regional defense, they want to see more investment in systems like TAPSAT and Patriot.
Which are? Remind me.
TAD is the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System. It's designed to intercept short and medium-range ballistic missiles.
So like the kind that North Korea or Iran might use.
Right. And then Patriot is a more versatile system. It can take down aircraft, cruise missiles, and some ballistic missiles, too.
So they're advocating for a layered approach to missile defense, a mix of systems to counter a range of threats.
Right. It's about having the right tools for the job, no matter what that job is.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. This document lays out a pretty bold vision for the future of the U.S. military.
It does. It's ambitious, comprehensive, and it doesn't shy away from controversy.
It really highlights the challenges facing the U.S. in a world where power dynamics are shifting, technology is advancing at an incredible pace, and the nature of warfare itself is evolving.
It's a world that requires new thinking, new approaches, and a willingness to adapt to a constantly changing threat environment.
And as we've seen, this document offers one perspective on how the U.S. military should respond to those challenges.
Whether you agree with their specific recommendations or not, it's clear that they've put a lot of thought into these issues.
It's a valuable contribution to the ongoing debate about the future of American power and the role of the military in the 21st century.
And that's really what we hope to achieve with these deep dives. To spark thoughtful conversation, to encourage people to engage with these complex issues, and to ultimately help all of us better understand the world around us.
So as we wrap up today, we want to leave you with a few questions to ponder. What aspects of this vision resonated with you most? What questions does it raise for you about the challenges facing the U.S. military and American power in the years ahead? These are complex issues with no easy answers, but they're issues that deserve our attention and our thoughtful engagement. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive for